9. Cold War submarine graveyard. Russia's Kola Peninsula is home to a Soviet-era submarine graveyard that was largely forgotten about until recent years. The vessels lay out of sight in a restricted part of Nezamednaya Cove near the Finnish border. The site is connected to a secretive naval base that's still active today. The subs were left there in the 1970s. At the time, Soviet shipyards were struggling to keep up with the demand for warships. Properly disposing of submarines simply wasn't a priority. Some of the decommissioned subs were reportedly used for target practice and sunk, while others were simply left to rust. But there are several reasons why it's a bad idea to simply dump a submarine or ship into the water and allow nature to take its course. Over the years, oil and rust polluted the waters at Nezamednaya Cove, and it took authorities a while to realize they had to act before it got any worse. They burned at least one submarine. The others were pulled from the water, dismantled, and recycled for their parts. Some of the subs were in good enough condition to be used as training vessels, and one ended up on display in a museum. Satellite imagery showed that as of 2007, there were at least 7 submarines still sitting in the water, and they were visibly beyond salvaging. 8. Iraqi Air Force jets. While searching for weapons of mass destruction in 2003 at Al Takadum airfield west of Baghdad, US military search teams found dozens of Iraqi force fighter jets buried in the sand. The shocking discovery was made when one of the search team members spotted the tail fin of a Cold War-era fighter jet sticking out of the sand. It was clear that the planes were fully intact when they were buried, but no measures had been taken to protect them from their surroundings. Several other abandoned aircraft were found hidden beneath trees and draped with camouflage sheets. To further conceal the jets, the Iraqi military had scattered the fields with planes that had been destroyed in previous wars, making it difficult for enemy bombers to choose targets that were worth striking. Before the Iraq War, intelligence analysts had estimated that the country's military had around 300 combat aircraft left over from the 1991 Kuwait War. But the Iraqi Air Force was conspicuously absent amid the onset of the conflict that began in 2003. This led US military officials to believe that the fighter jets were not being used because they were deemed inadequate against British and American air power. While the hidden planes were a lot less dangerous than the weapons of mass destruction that the search teams were looking for, they still represented weapons that Iraq was trying to hide. This left some American politicians and government officials extremely concerned about what else the country may have up its sleeve. 7. Space Shuttle External Fuel Tank. From 1977 to 1980, NASA used a full-scale model of an external fuel tank for its Space Shuttle program tests. After that, the 154-foot-long, 47-meter object was put on display in Mississippi, and then found a new home at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It remained there until 2013, when NASA started getting rid of old equipment from the Space Shuttle program, which had been discontinued in 2011. The agency auctioned off the external fuel tank model, but the winning bidder from California changed their mind when they realized how truly massive it was, and that it would be incredibly difficult to move it across the country. So the fuel tank went to the next highest bidder, the Wings of Dreams Aviation Museum in Keystone Heights, Florida. Volunteers generously lugged the gargantuan hunk of metal towards its destination using cranes, a barge, and 2 tugboats. They left it on the docks in Green Cove Springs, with plans to move it to the museum a few months later, but the journey ended there. It would be impossible to transport the fuel tank on land without closing 2 state highways and taking down street signs and cables along the way. In other words, completing this final leg of the journey would be a logistical nightmare, and it would also be incredibly expensive. The museum didn't have a sponsor to carry out this part of the mission, and the fuel tank continues to sit at the dock in Green Cove Springs. There's no clear word on if or when it'll finally be moved. 6. MV Panayotis. The breathtakingly beautiful Greek island of Zakynthos is home to a crescent-shaped beach called Navajo Beach. It's only accessible by boat, but it's nevertheless famous for its pristine white sand and for a mysterious wrecked freighter that sits on its shoreline. The ship, known as the MV Panayotis, ran aground during the 1980s. Rumor has it that it operated as a smuggling ship, carrying illegal cigarettes, alcohol, and other contraband, as well as humans across international borders without the proper permits. According to local legend, the Greek Navy cornered the vessel into the cove where it sits today. But the true story behind the wreck is far less exciting than that. Captain Charalambos Kompothekras Kodsoros claimed that his ship wasn't carrying anything illegal, and that it washed ashore due to mechanical problems and poor weather. Thieves were quick to appear and loot the ship's cargo. The captain said that he pursued legal action against the looters and then returned to the beach to retrieve the ship. But he was so awed by the sight of the ship against the scenic backdrop of vibrant blue waters and high cliffs that he decided to leave it where it was. And it wasn't a bad decision. Thanks to the wreck, Navaggio became Greece's most iconic beach and one of its top tourist attractions. Unfortunately, several visitors were harmed in a landslide in 2018, forcing the Greek Tourism Ministry to close the beach for safety reasons. Last year, a committee was appointed to determine the future of Navaggio Beach, including the best ways to protect it and whether to reopen it to the public. At last update, they were hoping to restore the wreck and make the site safe for visitors by summer, and to reopen it in a way that locals can benefit from the tourism revenue. Would you like to visit this beach? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. 5. Electric Car Cemetery. Last year, a photograph claiming to show an electric car graveyard in France went viral on social media. It was accompanied by a caption stating that electric cars get tossed in lots and left to rot because replacing their batteries is more expensive than replacing the cars themselves. The post also claimed that the battery's chemicals saturate the ground, defeating the environmentally friendly reasons that inspired the development of electric cars in the first place. Reuters fact-checked the post and found that the cars were not taken off the road because their batteries were dead. They were parked in the field when a contract between a local company and the government expired. The retired fleet was used as part of a car-sharing program called Autolib. Members could use the cars whenever they needed. As convenient as that sounds, the program struggled with booking and parking issues, as well as competition from Uber and other ride-sharing companies. When the contract ended, the company moved its 4,000 cars out of Paris and into the field south of the city. Contrary to the claims circulating on social media, it's unlikely that they'll sit there forever, languishing in a perpetual state of neglect. They've been sold to 2 different companies, including one that specializes in selling cars. Paul Alzerate, who heads one of the companies called Atis Production, told Reuters that the cars are stored properly and that they're not a pollution risk because their batteries have been removed. But the rising popularity of electric cars does pose potential problems when it comes to battery disposal and recycling. Each vehicle contains a half-ton lithium-ion battery, and the question of what to do with them once they're spent remains unanswered. There are environmental consequences to not recycling lithium-ion batteries, but no potential solutions have been developed. 4. Prinz Yugan. The Prinz Yugan was a Nazi naval warship that entered service at the beginning of World War II. In 1946, US forces seized it as a war prize and relocated it to the waters off Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. The American military nuked the ship twice, along with dozens of other vessels, in a series of tests codenamed Operation Crossroads. Prinz Yugan was only lightly damaged, but the experiment left it dangerously radioactive. After several failed decontamination attempts, the Navy towed it to Kwajalein Atoll and awaited further instructions on what to do with it. In the meantime, the contaminated ship began to take on water. 6 months later, it capsized, sank, and landed upside down on the seafloor while being towed for repairs. The vessel is still visible today in the shallow waters of Enubuj Island, where its propellers can be seen protruding above the waves. Experts began to warn as far back as 1974 that Prinz Yugan would leak oil into the South Pacific if it wasn't removed within 30 years. Starting in 2018, the US Army, Navy, and the Micronesian government worked together to pump all the oil out of the ship's fuel tanks. By then, the environment and the local population had already suffered plenty from the damaging radioactivity left behind by the nuclear tests. Removing the oil was part of a disturbingly overdue effort to protect both wildlife and humans from the lasting impact of American military's past activities. 3. Bartini BVVA14. During the Cold War, the United States and Russia competed for military superiority by engaging in a frenzied arms race. Each country stockpiled as many weapons as possible as a way to prove that they were bigger and better than the other, and in case actual physical warfare broke out. One of the USSR's main priorities was to prepare for possible deep-sea missile strikes. Throughout the 1970s, the Soviet Navy worked to combat this perceived threat by developing the Bartini BVVA14 plane. The amphibious aircraft was tasked with defending the Soviet border by detecting American submarines. Named after Italian designer Robert Bartini, the strange-looking plane was perched on pontoons. It was manned by a 3-person crew and was capable of vertical takeoff, as well as taking off and landing in the water. The Bartini BVVA14 worked by skimming along the water as it patrolled for enemy vessels. Only 2 prototypes were built before the project was ultimately scrapped, with one logging over 103 flight hours and 107 flights. Just one of the vehicles survives today, but it's not operational. It can be seen near the Russian Air Force Museum outside Moscow. A group of aviation enthusiasts campaigned for its revival in 2013, but their efforts were unsuccessful. 2. Liabo All Over. Built in Yugoslavia in 1976, the Liabo All Over was an Antarctic cruise ship that remained in service until 2010. After that, she was decommissioned and fell into disrepair as she sat docked for 2 years in the Canadian province of Newfoundland. A shipping company bought the vessel in 2012 with plans to dismantle and scrap it. But it broke free from its towline and the tugboat pulling it in early 2013, while en route to a shipbreaking facility in the Dominican Republic. Crew members tried to reattach the ship, but they were no match against the 10-foot, 3-meter waves and the 22-mile-per-hour, 35-kilometers-per-hour winds. The Liabo All Over eventually drifted back into the waters off eastern Canada, prompting the government to task an offshore vessel with regaining control of it. After towing the vessel back into international waters, the crew released it into the open ocean. In other words, it was no longer their problem in the eyes of Canadian authorities. Eyewitnesses later reported seeing the ship off Ireland and Iceland. In March 2013, its emergency position indicating radio beacon was detected off the coast of Kerry, Ireland. This type of signal is only transmitted when the device comes into contact with water, indicating that the Liabo All Over probably sank somewhere in the Atlantic. 1. Roa Aero train. At the Pueblo Railway Museum in Colorado, there's a paradoxically vintage yet futuristic-looking vehicle known as the Aerot train. Its test tracks sit thousands of miles away in the French countryside, where they look conspicuously out of place, to say the least. There's one platform on each end, as well as a middle station. A small portion of the tracks were destroyed, but the rest of the apparatus remains in place. But what's the story behind these pieces? Developed by French engineer Jean Bertin, the Aerot train was an experimental tracked air cushion vehicle, TACV. As one of the earliest hover trains, it traveled over a reinforced concrete monorail track on an air cushion created by powerful compressors. It was designed to eliminate the rolling resistance of wheeled vehicles and could travel at unprecedented speeds without the expensive complications that came along with the similarly designed maglev's electromagnetic track. The US-based company, Roa Industries, licensed Bertin's technology in 1969. In a bid to defeat its competitors for a high-speed ground transportation contract with the US Department of Transportation, the company's engineers designed and built a fully operational $10 million electric prototype. Designed to carry 60 passengers, the 94-foot, 29-meter vehicle could easily travel at speeds of at least 150 miles per hour, 241 kilometers per hour. A second prototype outperformed the first, reaching a record speed of 262 miles per hour, 422 kilometers per hour. But government funding for the project ran out, and despite its success, the Roa prototype was never commercialized. If Bertin's vision had been realized, the train would have undoubtedly been a state-of-the-art development that would have revolutionized rail travel.
Number 10. World War II soldiers' remains. The Recovery of the Fallen in Eastern Europe is a German non-profit devoted to uncovering the remains of World War II soldiers. Founded in 1992, the organization's stated mission is to permit a worthy burial of the dead of war and to return them their names. In other words, in addition to finding the bodies of fallen soldiers, the group also does its best to identify who the remains are and where they belong. World War II ended over 75 years ago, but countless soldiers still remain missing. It's not surprising considering the war's estimated military death toll of around 20 million. In the 3 decades since the nonprofit began its work, volunteers have carried out over 200 searches and have found the remains of more than 7,700 missing soldiers. They don't search for people of any specific nationality. Speaking with Haaretz, the association's chairman Albrecht Lau explained that lives were destroyed and people died needlessly on all sides. By identifying as many fallen soldiers as possible, the organization gives closure to families and helps to convey the cost of war to future generations by treating soldiers as individuals and separating them from the impersonal nature of statistics. The excavations also build friendships and bridges of understanding between people from nations that were once bitter enemies. Number 9. Strange spinning space object. While reviewing past data from the Murchison Wide Field Array Telescope in Western Australia earlier this year, an undergraduate student named Tyrone O'Doherty noticed an unusually bright object in the Milky Way galaxy about 4,000 light-years from Earth. He didn't think it was anything majorly significant at first, but he was intrigued enough to point it out to his colleagues and professor. Scientists took a closer look at the object and determined that for a 3-month period in 2018, it spewed powerful jets of energy for up to a minute at a time every 18 minutes. During these bursts of activity, it was one of the brightest radio objects in the sky. Whenever the object emitted energy, the next brightest thing in the sky was a supermassive black hole located millions of light-years away. Astrophysicist Natasha Hurley-Walker told ABC Australia that she initially expected it to be something scientists already knew about, like an exploding star or 2 stars colliding. But the spooky object was neither of those things. Dr. Hurley-Walker described it as being there 1 minute and gone the next, and said nothing does that. That's crazy. According to a recent study, it's probably a phenomenon that researchers have never observed until now, such as the spinning core of a dead star with a powerful magnetic field. It might also help to explain another mysterious occurrence known as fast radio bursts. Number 8. Raining teeth. A man from New Hampshire named Byron Carr was recently tasked with tearing down some storefronts in Concord for his employer, who wanted to revive the old-fashioned look that the buildings had during the 19th century. During the renovations, the man's co-worker came down from removing some old ceiling metal with 5 old yellow teeth in his hand. It was odd, but he discarded the teeth and went back to ripping up the ceiling. Suddenly, hundreds of teeth rained down on the co-worker. Carr snapped a picture of some of the decaying chompers and posted the story on the Forgotten New Hampshire Facebook page. He wrote that his co-worker was a bit creeped out for a while. When Byron's boss mentioned that there had been a dental office on the building's 2nd floor decades ago, he remembered going there as a child. In fact, one of the many teeth that fell on his fellow crew member could have belonged to Byron, who described the dentist as scary and looked like Alfred Hitchcock's twin. He also said that the dental office was spooky and recalled seeing his tooth fly across the room when the dentist popped it out. Perhaps the dentist had a bad habit of losing control of the teeth he pulled, which would explain why so many of them accumulated over the years. Number 7. Stalker Shrine. After being told by a previous renter that there was something strange in the attic of their townhouse, a group of housemates in Melbourne, Australia went up there to investigate. They found a so-called Stalker Shrine consisting of photos, clothing, band-aids, gum, cigarettes, and other items that were pinned to the wall. There was also a bar of soap and a container filled with red liquid. A TikToker named Matt Martin, who is dating one of the tenants, documented the experience for his followers. He explained in a follow-up video that the renters contacted the real estate agent who had leased the property to them, and the agent reached out to the landlord who bought the property in 2016. According to the owner, workers found a collection of personal belongings from the previous occupant while performing renovations years ago. They informed the landlord, but apparently nothing was done about it. Martin's girlfriend called the police, who were happy to take a report but said that there was nothing they could do if there were no body parts found. The housemates were shaken by the disturbing discovery, but Martin concluded that the weird array of objects was probably the handiwork of a creep with a weird obsession or a strange piece of artwork. He added that the group plans to take this display down and thoroughly clean the house. Number 6. Cryptic Carving. A Redditor who goes by the handle N5150 was exploring his girlfriend's attic recently when he spotted a terrifying message etched into the back wall. a 5-pointed star known as a pentagram, which is often associated with satanic worship, beneath the name Nick. He posted a photo of the discovery along with the caption, "Guess what my name is?" The bizarre etching was disturbing enough to begin with, but the fact that the man's name is Nick made it even more frightening. His post went viral, receiving over 90,000 upvotes within days. Fellow Redditors were quick to put in their 2 cents on the matter, with many encouraging Nick to leave his girlfriend's house immediately. One user pointed out that Old Nick is a nickname for the devil, suggesting that there could have been an even darker meaning behind the name's use. Another person theorized that Nick's girlfriend made the carving and encouraged him to get out while he's still alive. Some people took a more rational approach, speculating that the strange scrawling was probably nothing more than the product of teenage boredom. Hopefully, they're right. What do you think? Is the carving a valid cause for concern, or does it seem like the handiwork of a group of kids who had nothing better to do? Let us know in the comments below, but first, be sure to subscribe. Number 5. Backyard Burials. While digging a drainage hole for a patio in a family's backyard last year in Heytesbury, England, a work crew discovered human remains. A builder named Robbie Kearney was the first person to notice the skeletons, which he initially assumed were animal bones. But he realized they belonged to humans when he dug deeper and found a skull. The crew immediately stopped working and notified homeowners Matthew and Amelia Jackson, who called the police. A crime scene crew consisting of forensic officers and an archaeologist reported to the property. They counted 5 skeletons and determined that the remains are probably not recent. In fact, it's believed that they could date as far back as the 5th century, during the early medieval period, but experts think that they're younger than that. Discovered just 300 feet from the 12th century Church of St. Peter and St. Paul, the bones are likely from one of the many plague pits that are rumored to exist throughout the town, according to local historian Joe Charlesworth. The graves appear to be Christian and contain the remains of both males and females of varying ages. The bones were sent away for radiocarbon dating to confirm their age and will be respectfully reburied. Plague victims weren't always buried in mass graves, but the practice became common as a way to keep up with the alarming death rates as the disease wiped out as much as half of Europe's population over a 4-year period. People died so quickly and in such great numbers that most simply didn't have the luxury of giving their loved ones a proper burial. Number 4. Secret room filled with strange objects. A Welsh couple who recently bought a house at auction began finding weird things shortly after moving in. They discovered a secret room that contained a Bible hanging from a hook, and in the attic they found a suitcase filled with what appeared to be ritual objects, including a wooden cross. There were also items hidden in the walls, including a box, old photos, and mirrors. One picture of a man has holes poked through the eyes. The pair shared footage of their bizarre findings on TikTok and promised to update their followers as they researched to learn more about who used to live at the home. They said that the off-putting finds have made them feel like they made a huge mistake by buying a house at auction. It didn't help that they purchased the property without viewing it in person or checking the paperwork first. It's easy to see in the couple's videos that the house is old and in need of some major repairs. Many of their followers are encouraging them to leave the fixer-upper and find somewhere else to live. Number 3. A creepy coincidence. After buying a house together in northern Wales last year, Lisa Harrison and Dave Barnes realized that they were living on the same street that Lisa's father was born on 61 years ago in 1961. Her parents came over to help the couple decorate and discovered an even more shocking coincidence. While peeling wallpaper away in the master bedroom, her mother noticed a drawing. It was an outline of a pair of scissors with the names V. Harrison and G. Roberts written on them, along with November 1963. Victor Harrison was Lisa's paternal grandfather. As it turns out, he was the first person to decorate the house with the help of his business partner Gwen Roberts. 59 years later, the man's granddaughter bought the same home without any knowledge of the family connection. As spooky as the discovery was, it's also neat to know that the home unintentionally came back into the family. It's almost as if it was meant to be. Whether the couple plans to keep the house in the family for future generations remains to be seen, but even if they don't, perhaps a relative will end up there yet again without knowing its history. Number 2. Deformed alien skulls. During the 5th century Roman collapse, the empire abruptly abandoned its Pannonian territories in what is now Western Hungary as the conquering Huns invaded Central Europe. Around the same time, foreign groups began traveling to the region and joined the local Romanized settlements, turning the area into a melting pot of sorts. These rapidly changing dynamics resulted in a cultural shift that modern experts are still trying to understand. Since 1961, dozens of deformed skulls have been unearthed at an ancient Pannonian cemetery. Out of 96 burials, 51 bore signs of a practice called skull binding, which involves artificially stretching a person's head by tightly wrapping it during childhood, permanently altering it to give it what we think of as an alien-like appearance. The tradition of extreme body modification dates back to the Paleolithic era. It spread across Central Asia during the 2nd century BC and made its way to Europe shortly thereafter, according to a team of experts who spoke with Live Science about their research on the topic. The graves represent 3 distinct groups and span 3 generations that lived from around 430 to 470 AD when the site was abandoned. An analysis of the bones revealed that some of the individuals from the later burials were from the immediate area and lived there under Roman rule, while others migrated there after being displaced from other places. These groups had noticeably different burial customs, yet they all practiced skull binding, reflecting the tradition's spread across cultures. They used different techniques, which further indicates that skull binding was one of several cultural practices that were exchanged between the groups as they adjusted to living alongside one another in a shared community. Number 1. Ancient Burial Ground. In 2006, a group of kindergartners accidentally dug up bits of human bone on the playground outside their school in southwestern France. Experts took a closer look and realized that the school was built atop a large ancient burial mound dating back thousands of years. Nobody knew just how old the remains were until 2 years ago, when a study determined that the mound, known as Le Tumulus des Sables, is much older than researchers originally thought. The oldest remains are around 5,600 years old. People buried their dead here for a 2,000-year period starting in 3600 BC during the Neolithic era and ending around 1250 BC during the Iron Age. An archaeological team excavated at least 30 bodies, including 20 adults and 10 children, who were buried less than 2 feet in the ground. They also unearthed a plethora of grave goods, including broken ceramics, metal, and animal bones. While the researchers made some headway in determining the site's age and how long it was used for, they failed to figure out why it was chosen as a burial site by the prehistoric population that used it. As lead study author Hannah James pointed out, there's nothing outwardly prestigious or significant about it. The site isn't located on a hill or in any other obvious type of place, yet people used it for an incredibly long time, which suggests that it was important to them for some reason. The individuals who were buried there are also a mystery to experts. A dental analysis revealed that most of the deceased were locals who sourced their food from the land instead of fishing in the nearby river or in the Atlantic Ocean. But that's about all that's known about the mysterious prehistoric culture. Number 8. Nuclear-powered submarines. The Cold War ended in the early 1990s, yet the competition between the US and Russia for military superiority seems to be alive and well. It's making some people wonder if the threat of nuclear warfare between the two superpowers still lurks, waiting for tensions to reach a boiling point. The Russian Navy is currently working to replace its outdated Soviet-era fleet with a new line of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. Interestingly, plans for the updated fleet, known as Borei-class submarines, were already in the works before the Soviet Union fell. Design work began during the mid-80s, and construction on the first vessel began in 1996. In 2013, news agencies reported that the Russian Navy will use its Borei-class submarines to resume strategic patrols in southern latitudes that had not seen a Russian presence in 2 decades. The vessels are part of the Navy's nuclear deterrent force, which also consists of 4 newly developed Khabarovsk-class submarines. Each Khabarovsk-class sub will carry 6 nuclear-powered drone torpedoes that are capable of traversing across oceans to strike coastal cities and military bases. These bombs are capable of causing 10 times as much damage as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. It's probably safe to say that even Russia wants to avoid launching a nuclear attack, which would likely be met with an equally or more destructive response from the US. Nobody truly wins in a situation like that, but it's still scary to think about what might happen if things escalate between the two countries, which are currently at odds over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Number 7. It starts with words. The United States and North Korea have never had a good relationship. Our strained history dates back to the Korean War and is perpetuated by America's continued support of capitalist South Korea, among other factors. From a young age, school children in the Hermit Kingdom are taught that Americans are murderous imperialists who started the Korean War. But anti-American propaganda is not the only thing fueling the tensions between these longtime adversaries. Shortly after entering office in 2018, former President Donald Trump made some rather outspoken comments about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Trump wasted no time escalating his insensitive banter to verbal cheap shots, calling the nuke-obsessed dictator a little rocket man, and finding other wildly unprofessional ways to taunt him. Kim responded by calling Trump a mentally deranged dotard. The obnoxious tit-for-tat somehow led to plans for the two to sit down and have a civilized talk about how the two countries can move forward peacefully. They signed a historic document agreeing to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. Many criticized the move as a vain attempt to improve relations with the country, especially after a verbal back and forth nearly brought things between the US and North Korea to a boiling point shortly before the meeting. The takeaway? If tensions erupt between the two countries, it could very easily start with words. Number 6. A new Cold War. A new era of fear and uncertainty is setting in as Russian forces storm the Ukrainian border in a long-feared assault of missile and gunfire. Countless onlookers around the world are wondering what the future will bring, if their country will get involved in the crisis, and what types of effects it could have on the rest of the world. One major question that keeps coming up is if the United States will directly participate in the fighting. So far, President Biden has vowed to remain uninvolved in the conflict, but he has escalated the U.S. military presence in several European countries, sending troops and equipment to Germany, Poland, Estonia, Romania, and elsewhere, vowing to defend every inch of NATO territory against Russian aggression. The U.S. is among several nations that have imposed hefty economic and trade sanctions against Russia, where the ruble has plummeted to an all-time low due to the invasion. But it'll take some time to tell whether these sanctions will be effective in stopping further conflict. Staying out of Ukraine may help to avoid direct combat between America and Russia, but at the very least, the U.S. is heavily involved from the sidelines, and there's speculation that we could find ourselves entangled in another Cold War type of standoff with the fellow nuclear superpower. It's likely that American soldiers will repopulate bases that the military hasn't used since the early 90s when forces cleared out following the Soviet Union's collapse. These prospects have alarming overtones of the hostilities that lingered for 40 years as the US and Russia vied for military superiority and world dominance. Many are worried, rightfully so, that history is on the brink of repeating itself. Number 5. NATO versus Russia. Because Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, it is not receiving direct support from NATO forces, even as Russia attempts to take the country by force. Instead, thousands of NATO troops are being dispatched to allied countries in Eastern Europe. If Russia attacks a NATO country, the organization will respond with force. But for now, NATO is refusing to directly participate in the conflict. The decision not to get involved comes after Ukraine expressed an interest in joining the alliance. This is one of the factors that apparently triggered Putin to launch the invasion. Russia has made it clear that it is strongly opposed to Ukraine becoming a NATO country. Speaking with the BBC recently, Ukrainian ambassador to Britain Vadim Pristaiko said that his country was threatened and blackmailed by Russia for its attempt to join the organization. Military experts think that it's unlikely that Russia will invade NATO's eastern flank. As U.S. President Joe Biden pointed out, the military alliance is more united than ever. Article 5 of the NATO treaty outlines the organization's policy that an attack against one member is an attack against all members. And while it has not been formally invoked in this case, Biden and other leaders have made it clear that they are ready and willing to defend their NATO allies on a moment's notice. The alliance was created in 1949 amid growing fears of an attack by Germany or the Soviet Union. Its membership has grown since from 12 to 30 countries, including many former Soviet states and satellite territories. NATO is a powerful organization, and Russia sees it as a national security threat. As Ukraine's future as a sovereign state becomes increasingly jeopardized, the possibility of it becoming the next NATO member is more uncertain than ever. What do you think may happen next? Are you worried about the potential escalation? Share in the comments and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Number 4. It could inspire other conflicts. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has sparked fears of potential conflict among other states with shaky relations. Hours after military vehicles rolled into Ukraine from neighboring Belarus and began advancing toward the capital of Kyiv, officials began voicing their concerns about China's possible plans against Taiwan. That same day, Taiwan's Air Force warned off 9 Chinese aircraft that entered its airspace as part of a military exercise. Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu appealed for continued U.S. support, citing an ongoing military threat from China, which claims ownership of the island. Relations between China and Taiwan have long been strained. China views self-ruled Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually rejoin the country, while Taiwan sees itself as an independent country. Tensions between the two states have increased in recent years as Chinese President Xi Jinping has said that reunification must be fulfilled. In fact, Taiwan's defense minister said that relations are at their worst point in 40 years. During a virtual event at the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University, Foreign Minister Wu expressed the need for the Taiwanese people to be able to defend themselves against mainland forces. He stressed the importance of continued arms sales, military exchanges, shared intelligence, and other assistance from the U.S. as a way to make Taiwan an unattractive target to China. Chinese officials have warned that the country hasn't ruled out using force to bring Taiwan under its control and that it won't tolerate any foreign interference with these measures. What the future holds remains to be seen. Number 3. England versus Russia. The United Kingdom is one of many countries whose citizens are wondering how involved their government will become with the current Russia and Ukraine crisis. Some experts have pointed out that certain European countries may be more hesitant than the US to show aggression toward Russia because they're closer to the country and therefore more in danger of direct hostilities. Additionally, some countries like England have a large influx of Russian wealth from financial and property investments, which means that going to war could severely jeopardize their economy. President Boris Johnson condemned Putin for the violence being waged against Ukraine and announced plans to impose a massive package of sanctions designed to cripple the Russian economy. Much like the US, it is Britain's hope that this will be enough to stop the needless attacks that have already killed dozens, including at least one child. But it's possible that the sanctions won't work the way they're intended. They could cause Russia to retaliate against the punishing countries. In the event of an attack against the UK, it would undoubtedly lead to a major war between Russia, Britain, and its NATO allies, including the US. As of right now, this is considered highly unlikely, but the attacks on Ukraine probably won't end anytime soon. The sanctions against Russia won't have an immediate effect. Any damage they do will take time to set in. Plus, Putin probably knew the country would face sanctions and likely has a plan to somehow manage despite any damage they may cause to Russia's economy. In this case, it lessens the possibility that these newly imposed policies will help to put an end to the violence in Ukraine. If sanctions don't work, it begs the question of how far Putin will go in his pursuit to expand his power, and whether the countries that have vowed to avoid direct conflict, such as England and the US, will feel they have no choice but to step in. Number 2. The US versus China. The question of what would happen if the US and China went to war has been asked many times, and the answers have changed dramatically over the years. As Robert Farley pointed out, at one time the only fathomable motivations for a war between the countries would be disputes over Taiwan or North Korea. These are still distinct possibilities, but the number of scenarios that could lead to direct military conflict between China and America has grown in recent years, along with China's expanding interests and capabilities. One likelihood involves China's disputed territorial claims in the East and South China Seas. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping told the People's Liberation Army that they should persist in using combat to guide their work. There are numerous different approaches that the US could take if one of these unfortunate scenarios took place. In many cases, it's likely that a great deal of a war would take place in East Asia, giving China the advantage of fighting in familiar and close territory. Attacking China's shipping fleet would be one way for the US to gain an upper hand, depending on the circumstances. This could potentially cripple the country's economic lifelines. Once upon a time, China had a slim chance of defeating the US regardless of where a conflict happened. After years spent building up its military and increasing its war budget, that's no longer the case. Just how much of a threat the country's military would pose to the US is debatable, but it is clearly capable of inflicting some serious damage. Do you consider war between China and the US in the near future a major concern? Tell us in the comments below. Number 1. A second American Civil War. In recent years, Americans have become increasingly divided over social and political issues, including police brutality and other forms of racial inequality, gun control, abortion, allegedly rigged elections, and other things. Things have only become more heated amid stark disagreements on COVID safety protocols and whether these measures are necessary or if they infringe upon our basic freedoms. Many have started to wonder if there's a chance of the United States erupting into a second civil war. To some, it's unthinkable. But there seems to be a growing number of people who see it as a realistic prospect. Earlier this year, President Joe Biden urged the American people to think about whether they want to be the type of nation that accepts political violence as a norm. He posed this question on the one-year anniversary of the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which resulted in 5 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Naturally, many people feared that the violent riot marked the beginning of a chapter of civil unrest and conflict that would only worsen. Even the mainstream media began to seriously address the possibility of a civil war. In a country where inequality is ever present, radical groups have emerged with the apparent goal of deepening the divide. Political scientist Barbara Walter, who recently wrote a book on civil wars and has served on the CIA's Political Instability Task Force, told reporters that she's noticed a few telltale signs that the U.S. could be heading in a dangerous direction. One is the increasing tendency for people to organize more along racial, ethnic, or religious lines rather than ideology or specific policies. Another is the fact that by late 2020, 90% of the Republican Party was white, something that in any culturally and ethnically diverse country with a two-party system, the task force would have considered dangerous. So far, the US has managed to avoid another civil war, but there's no telling whether tensions will reach a boiling point. If a war did happen, it would likely take the form of an insurgency among widespread militia groups rather than a centralized and unified force. Though this is a deeply concerning topic, we hope you've gained something out of our coverage. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for spending time with us, and we look forward to sharing more with you in our next video right here on American Eye.